Thank you for joining me for part 2 of the mini podcast series on the Code of Chivalry. In episode 1, we discussed the Code of Chivalry as from the Song of Roland. The song was written at about 1100 after Christ, and was really kind of talking about a battle and a time and an era of his liege lord Charlemagne and the code of conduct of the knights during that time. In episode 1, we covered the first 5 of 17 total points in the Code of Chivalry. Those 5 points were to fear God and maintain his church, to serve the liege lord in valor and faith, to protect the weak and defenseless, to give succor to widows and orphans, and to refrain from the wanton giving of offense. If you want to hear my very short takes on each of those subjects, again, go listen to part 1, which I believe is called, what's the name of that one? Chivalry Isn't Dead If We Keep It Alive. That's part 1 of this series. Now, in part 2, we want to talk about the next 6 of the 17 points, beginning with to live by honor and for glory. To live by honor and for glory. This is, to me, one of the most straight-up knightly points of the Code of Chivalry. To live by honor and for glory. What is honor? And if you just Google honor, it will say honor is the idea of a bond between an individual and a society as a quality of a person that is both of social teaching and of personal ethos that manifests itself as a code of conduct and has various elements such as valor, chivalry, honesty, and compassion. So it's kind of how you are viewed by society, how you are valued by society. And it is your way of acting that you always do the right thing. Now, that, first of all, of course, comes as Catholics, that if we simply want to make it to heaven, which should be our primary goal, then, of course, we must do the right thing. But we should also do it in terms of societal welfare and doing the right thing for ourselves and for our neighbors, because we want to be honorable men and we want to be viewed as so, especially because we're Catholics, and especially if our society and our neighbors know us to be so. Now, the second word is that, and for glory. Now, that is a very interesting word that I think that few people would think of using in today's language, that you want to try to achieve glory. But I guess it depends on what type of glory you're imagining. When I think of glory, I know that the movie made in 1989 with Matthew Broderick, where he is a colonel during the Civil War in America, and he is a colonel over a regiment of black soldiers. Now, obviously, this is a time where black men in America were not exactly treated equally as white men, and they were fighting for the freedom of slaves, among other things. And it's a very potent story and a very good movie. I highly recommend it. Again, it's just called Glory. And I think that's the type of glory that you want. And in the end, these men go facing their deaths at the front of a battle, almost certain that they will all die. But they do it for each other, they do it for their country, and they do it for glory. Now, of course, ultimately, the ultimate glory that we should seek is the glory of God. But there is also a glory in yourself and in your country, as long as you're doing it, of course, for the right reasons, which should start with God. Now, the next point is to despise pecuniary reward. Now, I think this is a very interesting point. So, pecuniary reward, meaning you should not do something in order to get money. Now, I think in terms of being a knight, yeah, okay, this is a little bit, I guess, again, outdated, that maybe they're saying don't do a good deed because you might get something for it. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense, that your good deeds should simply come from your heart, and in order to do the right thing, to do God's will, and to try to be like Christ, and not in order to get praise even, not necessarily monetary reward, but to do something without any hope of worldly praise or reward. The next point is to fight for the welfare of all. Now, we spoke a little bit about this in the first part of this series, and it goes similarly to protect the weak and defenseless. And I think that that's also similar here. And this is actually a topic that I'm going to cover in a podcast that I'm actually recording today, and it's going to be about patriotism and nationalism and the pros and cons of each, mainly trying to argue patriotism versus what we now know as nationalism. And I highly recommend, if you wanted to hear more about the subject, go and check out that video, which will be called something like The Isms, Patriotism versus Nationalism. Next up in these points, talking about the Code of Chivalry, according to the Song of Roland, is to guard the... Oh, I'm sorry. Nope. The next one is to obey those placed in authority. Now, this is another one. I just recently did 3 whole podcasts talking about our need to obey authority, and that we must obey authority, even worldly authority, unless it goes against the teachings of the church and against our own faith and morals. And there's a very good reason for it, and it's because if people start going on their own whim and and not following what worldly authority tells them to do, then you'll have chaos and disorder. Christ and the apostles teach in many different points that we should obey worldly authority unless it is directly against the teachings of God and of Christ. Now, next up is to guard the honor of fellow knights. And I like this one. I think, again, this is slightly outdated, but again, I think it's fitting for today's times that we should look out for our brothers, our friends, and even those who are not our brothers or friends, and to try to, instead of being the ones who are behind the slanderous talk or the gossip, that we try to stop that we defend them, and that we make sure that we never let lies or even ugly truths escape from our mouths about somebody else. Gossip, of course, is a sin, and it's sinful to disparage someone's name, especially behind their back. And we need to keep that in mind, if that's in person or if it's over text, in Twitter, Facebook, whatever, that we should always try to act charitably and to guard the honor of fellow knights and fellow men. The final one in today's episode, and this is honestly a word that I had to look up how to say, I hope I say it right, but is to eschew unfairness, meanness, and deceit. Now, eschew, which I believe I looked up earlier, means to get away with, pretty much, to throw away. So to get away with unfairness, meanness, and deceit. And again, that's a fairly simple one, to just be a nice person. I mean, if you're going to be a knight, first of all, you have to be, just somewhat fairly decent. And I think that's a good point in this whole idea of a code of chivalry, that first of all, you have to fear God and maintain his church. That's the first point in the whole thing. And secondly, you just have to treat your fellow man with charity, treat them as Christ would treat them, and treat them as if they were Christ. And if you can do that to everyone you meet, then you are in a very, very good way to becoming, a form of knight and someone who spreads that light and goodness in a world that is very, very much in need of it. And those are the 6 points that I wanted to cover today. And I just want to say to anyone listening, especially the men, but the women as well, that we should find strength in our times and know that we were put on this world at this time for a reason. It's not an easy time. It's not the best of times. It's a very hard time with what's going on in the Catholic Church and the decisions that we have to make in order to follow Christ's true teachings. But we're here for a reason, and God trusts us here for this reason, and we need to appreciate that trust and to pick up that burden and pick up Christ's cross that he gives us and carry it as best we can and carry it in a way as an example to everyone else around us. And I'm going to do a show coming up about how I think we can directly, right now, shine forth that light a little further with examples of how I'm trying to do it myself, and how I think many people as well could do in trying to be that light on top of a mountain to lead everyone else to God and eventually, God willing, to heaven. That's all I've got for you today. Thanks for sticking with me, and be sure to stay tuned for the last portion of the Code of Chivalry, which will be coming out in the next few days. Until then, God bless.
You've been listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family. You can support the production on Patreon and PayPal, and you can reach Kevin at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, all for the greater glory of God.